Good afternoon. It is Saturday, January 20th, 2018 at 12:51 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm going to be going through the testimony in the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence for the House of Representatives, and they have released Glenn Simpson's testimony. In case you've missed it on my channel, I've done a part 1 and a part 2 of Glenn Simpson's testimony in the Senate, and I have also broken down the dossier and used it in an expose against itself. I will place the links to those videos in the description box below. They were quite entertaining. Now, given that I have that background, let me just let you know that the Senate the Senate hearing was done back in August, and this one happened in November of 2017. So a lot more had come out into the public sphere at that point, whereas in the Senate committee, the testimony was very, very mundane and very broad and not very detailed, but we were able to, extract a number of different kind of tangents and talking points and all kinds of nonsense from it. In this one, we get a lot more meat and potatoes about what Glenn Simpson actually is trying to convince people is happening with him in Russia and all kinds of business things that contradict themselves. And to be quite honest with you, the names he throws out, the things that he throws out in this testimony, it's worth a look at because, they're connections that he says are actually there. And it would be worth a look to see what's real and what's not. I will tell you again, 3% of what comes out of this man's mouth is anything other than speculation and a spin. He claims consistently and over that he is not a partisan, but I will prove to you significant reasons why he is a partisan hack, as much as he wants to tell everybody that he's not, and he's impartial and unbiased. Not the case. So let's just get started into this. On page 9, they go through all their mumbo jumbo in here. There are some redactions and things of that nature. And it's not easy to flip to pages, so you'll have to bear with me as I do this. I've also made it very big for you, so hopefully you can read it along with me. So on page 9, Gowdy is actually questioning Simpson, and he asked about fair and balanced. And Simpson goes into a nonpartisan sort of shtick. But on page 219 of the Senate testimony, he states how surprised he was about the results of the election. So on page 219 here, Glenn Simpson says, so after the election, obviously we were as surprised as everyone else, and Chris and I were concerned about the United States and blah, 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 blah. Who was surprised about the results of the election? And I talked about this before. Everybody but people that were on Team Trump, everybody but Trump voters, everybody but, certain people in the media that knew that the polls were nonsense. The only people who were, quote, surprised were the Democrats, establishment, hacks, not people, just the people in power, the elitist, leftist craziness that Glenn Simpson is a part of. They were the ones who were surprised. Everyone else, who's everyone? Not us. I wasn't surprised about it. So who's he talking about? He's a partisan. So Glenn Simpson says, we've only had a very small number of political clients. Remember that. He says they've only had a very small number of political clients. So I can tell you, our methodology doesn't really change. My firm is, all the principals are former journalists. So we don't come out of the political combat industry. We come out of the, journalism industry, which is all about sort of sticking to the facts and not leaping to conclusions and not trying to, come up with a hit piece on anybody. So generally speaking, what we get compensated for is producing reliable treatments of whatever the subject is. And I should add, it doesn't help us or our clients if we only look for negative information. What the clients want is all the information. And so, someone, if you're in a campaign and the, other side is a businessman, and if you're reviewing his career, it's important information whether he's a good businessman or a bad businessman. And you don't want your client trying to make an issue of his business career if he's a brilliant businessman who knows how to make money in an honest and ethical way. So sticking to the facts, not leaping to conclusions, and not trying to come up with a hit piece on anybody are 3 things that Glenn Simpson says he does, but clearly demonstrates otherwise throughout his own testimony. And we'll get there. On On page 10, he starts talking about facts in journalism, proving facts and gathering and presenting in an impartial manner. But we know that that's not true. He basically says, factual information, a lot of what we do is gather facts. And sometimes facts are provable facts. Sometimes facts are established facts. Sometimes they're allegations, factual allegations. So we do all of the above. When you gather up lawsuit information, for example, you have two sides making factual allegations against each other. And what's important is that you have a reliable, credible basis for your information. And it's a lot like journalism, in that journalism is called the first draft of history, where essentially you're gathering up information and your job is not to determine the truth. It's to gather credible information and present it, and to present all the possibilities, all the reliable information you can find. But every day in the newspaper, every story has two sides to it. And it's not the reporter's job to figure out who's telling the truth and who's not, or who's right and who's wrong. It's to be responsible and professional in gathering up all the facts and allegations and presenting them in a neutral way. So our method is journalistic, and our reports are written along those lines. If I were to take a poll of the audience at this point in time, I think that 99% of you would disagree with what this man's saying right now, because it's not true. That's not what journalism is, at least in the mainstream anymore. And I actually would kind of differ with the assessment that you gather up what you think may be facts and it's not your job to kind of prove what's true. Maybe that's classic journalism, but I don't think that we can do that anymore in this country. Okay, on page 12, information comes out about the Washington Free Beacon job, which was stopped in 2016. So basically, the Washington Free Beacon was the first outlet to engage Fusion GPS. And Glenn Simpson says we can talk about that because it's out in the public. But he gets very dicey when it comes to the rest of the information, which we'll get to in a second. What's really important to note here is that he's talking basically about working with an outlet that stopped their retention of Fusion GPS after the primaries, and they just let all the work go. They didn't even focus on it anymore because their engagement was over. So here, Mr. Gowdy, which is Trey Gowdy, says, at some point, did the Washington Free Beacon stop paying you for the project into then-candidate Trump? Did the business relationship end? And Glenn Simpson says, I remember that we stopped doing the Trump work for Beacon sometime in the spring of 2016. And then he starts to ask another question. Did you pick up? And then they go off the record. And then he says that the work stopped in April or May. So, interesting there. On page 13 here, he establishes that Perkins Coie hired him for the second bit of the Trump-Russia stuff. And they squabble back and forth a little bit about them doing work for the DNC. So Simpson's basically stating in this testimony that it's publicly available information that the DNC retained Perkins Coie as their attorneys. And Gowdy is trying to wrestle out of him how he knows it, but Glenn Simpson's basically saying, because it's public knowledge, not because they told me. And they go back and forth, and they argue about client confidentiality, and it takes up a lot of Trey Gowdy's time. He goes into a little detail about whether he's worked for them in the past, and he says he can't answer. Confidentiality requirements come in, blah, 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 blah. They go back and forth. Let's talk to the lawyer. It's just a bunch of time wasting. For some reason, and I think I know why, Trey Gowdy wants Glenn Simpson to, state that he knew he was working for the DNC when he took up this job because Perkins Coie told him that they were. But it's not going anywhere. Page 16. They're arguing back and forth on page 16 about what information Glenn Simpson will be forced to give them. And they basically state that, during the Carter Page testimony, which I read and I didn't do a video on, the House committee forced Carter Page to give out personal email and cell phone numbers on the record. And Carter Page was very, very scared about doing that. And here, Rooney's arguing that if they were forced Page to give up information that he didn't want to, and it was personal and sensitive information, then Simpson should be held to the same standard. So Page, what they basically end up coming down to is that Page came in, he wouldn't go in voluntarily. He wouldn't come like Simpson did here voluntarily. He had to be subpoenaed, and Simpson is there voluntarily. So that standard is different for Simpson because they don't have subpoena power over him. It's a voluntary interview. And they go back and forth about that a little bit. Also on page 16, it says to start at, he won't answer the question. Oh, this is basically talking about how the I'm trying to find a good way to say this. Because they're in front of the House committee, and he is under oath, but his testimony is voluntary. They had a set of agreements that they came to beforehand. And the folks here are saying, on the committee are saying that typically we don't recognize client-attorney privilege as, client-to-client privilege or confidentiality agreements in this setting. Meaning that they don't count. If you have a personal agreement with somebody, I'm not allowed to say this, that's a document, that does not count when you're testifying in front of a committee in government. But because he's there voluntarily and they've come to some sort of an agreement, that stuff doesn't matter. And they're trying to figure out how to document the objection. So they say he won't answer the question, so there's been an objection. And I'll just say that the witness is reminded that he may refuse to answer a question only to preserve a testimonial privilege. Neither the U.S. House of Representatives nor the committee recognizes any purported non-disclosure privileges associated with common law, including attorney-client privilege, attorney work product protections, and neither the House of Representatives or the committee recognizes any purported contractual privileges, including those supposedly deriving from non-disclosure agreements. I think that spells it out pretty clearly. On page 19 and 20, Trey Gowdy is trying to get Simpson to admit that he knew that Perkins Coie was working for the DNC again, and Simpson again skates around the issue. And then Gowdy says that he has a release from Perkins Coie in front of him, and he tells Simpson, this release is telling me more than you're offering. And they waste time getting the docs in order, and then finally Simpson says on page 20, it's harder to do this because there's no line numbers. He says, I'd like to see a copy of that if you don't mind, in reference to this release that Gowdy's talking about. And Simpson apologizes and says, I'm sorry if I'm not giving you a clear answer. I knew it was the DNC that we were working for. And he says he's been in Washington for a long time and he knows that Perkins Coie represents the DNC, blah, 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 blah. I'm in a difficult position. Nobody cares about the position you're in. On page 21, I'm going to read here. So we began to develop more specific lines of inquiry. So the things that we started looking at specifically were a lot of Mr. Trump's overseas business deals, his history with regard to tax disputes. We were interested in things like his clothing line and where I can't remember exactly when this came up, but we gradually figured out that while he was running on a platform of economic nationalism, that he's outsourced his clothing line to developing countries. So we were interested in the labor practices around his factories. I just wanted to make a point here because this argument has been brought up several times by people that are opposed to Donald Trump, etc. And I think he was very transparent during the campaign about this. And I think that he is, very honest about it. He did his work overseas because the way that Obama had decimated, and before him, Bush even, and before that, Clinton, had decimated the ability to do business in this country. Regulation, tax burden, etc., so on and so forth. It literally doesn't make business sense to manufacture product in the United States back at this time when he's running his businesses, which is why he's always been so passionate about trade deals and business regulation and taxes for corporations, etc. So, of course, a smart businessman, and a lot of people might not like this, but when you have people that are enemies of the country running the country, it's really hard to make a profit and stay in business when you're trying to do things in America because you can get them for half as much elsewhere. So you can't make money because you can't stay competitive because everyone else is doing their stuff out in other countries. So that's the reason why he went to other countries. He's running on a platform of economic nationalism, if you want to call it that. But given the state of the way the economy was and what he was running against, he's trying to, you know what I'm saying? Like, this is just a stupid argument, and I just wanted to take a minute to talk about it. It's always bothered me. On page 22, Mr. Simpson tells Miss Trey Gowdy, I don't remember being given a specific expense budget, but the fees were $50,000 a month. So the Perkins Coie is paying them $50,000 a month plus expenses to do the work into Donald Trump. Which apparently, you know, the scope of that work is far outside the bounds of just the dossier. You know, Simpson's doing his work on his own. He's got other subcontractors coming in and looking into other things. And he's got Steele doing the dossier. Because he brought in Steele when he exhausted all of his avenues from the public sphere, from publicly available open source information. Pages 24 to 25. I hate that. Steele says in here that he's made a number of trips to Russia, but he's never done a business deal there, and that was mysterious. So he says, and then, you know, we also increasingly saw that Mr. Trump's business career had evolved over the prior decade into lots of projects in overseas places, particularly in the former Soviet Union, that were very opaque, and that he had made a number of trips to Russia, but said he'd never done a business deal there. And I found that mysterious. Really? A number of trips that actually ends up by Simpson's testimony to be 4 or 5. And he finds it very mysterious. And so I had the perfect person to go see if they could figure out what was going on there. And so that's how I decided to ask Chris if he could look into it for me. And I had the initial engagement with Chris was much like we do. I didn't hire him for a long-term engagement. I said, take 30 days, 20 or 30 days, and we'll pay you a set amount of money and see if you can figure out what Trump's been up to over there. Because he's gone over a bunch of times. He said some weird things about Putin, but he doesn't seem to have gotten any business deals. So nobody, you know, if I travel to Italy 4 or 5 times and I don't come back with a business deal, should I be investigated by somebody? Even if I'm an international business person and I go over there 4 or 5 times and don't get a business deal, does that warrant investigation? It just seems ridiculous to me. Maybe I'm naive to, you know, the fact that everybody needs to have a business in every country they step foot in. It could be. It could be that I'm naive, but I doubt it. Pages 24 to 25. Basically what we get out of this is that, you know, Simpson says that Trump made a number of trips to Russia, but had never done a business deal there, and that was mysterious. Fusion GPS paid Steele $160,000. And Simpson says that they expensed Perkins Coie for the money for Steele. So he basically says, I think we've told the committee from the bank records it was around $160,000. And the initial engagement was for $20,000 or $30,000. And then there's currency differences. So if you do the math on that, figure they were retained for 8 months. So if they made $50,000 a month, let's pretend it's 12 months. It would be $500,000 for from Perkins Coie to Fusion. And then Fusion also billed Perkins Coie another $160,000 for Christopher Steele on top of what they paid Fusion GPS. That's a lot of cash. Page 26. Did Christopher Steele go to Russia as part of this project? And Glenn Simpson says, no, sir. And Trey Gowdy says, well, how did you know that? And Glenn Simpson says, well, that's what he told me. I mean, assuming, unless it was a covert thing that he was keeping from his client, he would have billed me for it. And then Trey Gowdy says, how was he able to accumulate information in Russia if he didn't go? And then Glenn Simpson goes into a whole big thing about how he he's been exposed as a former undercover British intelligence officer, so it wouldn't have been smart for him to go there. On page 27 here that we're going over, Glenn Simpson didn't know who Christopher Steele's sources were and did not corroborate the sources. He says basically Glenn Simpson does public records and we don't do much interviewing, but he's familiar with how Steele does his work. And generally you have a network of sources who come in from the place that you're interested in. And Trey Gowdy says, were you able to vet or corroborate or contradict any of the sources or subsources? And Simpson says, we did get into assessing the credibility of the sources and whether they were in a position to know things that they were saying. I didn't ask for specific identities of specific people. Some people, I think I know who they are for other reasons, but that's as much as I can say. We did a lot of, when the first reports come in, we did a lot of discussing whether this was credible information. And obviously, evaluating human intelligence is not the same thing as looking at documents. And so it's a much trickier process and the thresholds are different. And so what you're really trying to do, it's kind of like interviewing in journalism, is figure out whether there's a reason to think that what's being said is credible. And so we did a lot of that. Can you give me an example of anything that he produced that you found to be not credible? No, I don't think anything comes to mind. I must say my original reaction to this was to suspend judgment. I was not particularly interested in some of the things that he found that are among the most controversial because I didn't think they were useful or important for what I was trying to do. And he basically says he found everything to be credible, right? And he says that the first memo and, that the salacious part of it, in quotes, that they found, that wasn't really concerning to him. But remember, and we're going to get into this again, that was the basis of Steele going to the FBI. That was it. That was what Steele said was so concerning he needed to go to the FBI. Now we're going to go down to pages 33 and 34. And Schiff asks, can you tell us what publications your work appeared within in terms of the work you were doing for the Free Beacon? And Simpson says, I would struggle to come up with a list right now. That was, a good while ago. I think we probably had inquiries from, all the networks and most of the major papers. And I don't have a specific recollection of who published what. Schiff says, did your work product appear on Fox News? Simpson, I honestly don't know. Schiff says, and how about Breitbart? Simpson, again, I'm sorry to say, I don't have any recollection. And Schiff says, now you don't have a recollection because there might be other people at the firm who would be providing that information, or it would be you, but you just don't recall. Simpson says, it would be a little bit of both. I mean, those aren't my go-to news sources. I don't really spend a lot of time. I don't read Breitbart every day, and I certainly don't watch Fox every day. Really? Well, I mean, you're supposed to be so unbiased and all you're consuming is liberal left media? Huh, that's interesting. So Schiff is asking about what news sources the first Oppo research appears in, and Schiff asks about Fox and Breitbart, and Simpson says it would be a little of both. All the talk about being nonpartisan, and he is clearly partisan. And you can make the argument he's saying he's nonpartisan in his work, but we all know that it is, especially for someone with such an agenda, as we now know he had, and so many connections to so many people in so many places that are really in deep crap right now. It would be really hard to believe that he could be unbiased in his research. Really hard. So on page 38, Schiff is asking about evidence that Trump's engaging with Russians in money laundering through real estate. And he says, did you find evidence of that with respect to Mr. Trump? And Simpson says, evidence, I think, is a strong word. I think we saw patterns of buying and selling that we thought were suggestive of money laundering. So I shudder to think what they would have found if they took 3 minutes to look into just the Clinton Foundation. He states that there was a Russian gangster living in Trump Tower and he can't remember his name, but that was a huge concern. So I couldn't spell his name, but he was living in Trump Tower. And he was running a high-stakes gambling ring out of Trump Tower. You know who else lives in Trump Tower? There's so many people that live in Trump Tower. And this is where we get into, with Schiff specifically, he's looking for Simpson to tell him where he investigated and what kind of shady ties and all kinds of stuff. And, all of this is very loose, very, very loose stuff. He says that there's fraud and that Russians may or may not have put money into some of these business deals. And, he doesn't know. He says may or may not, and it doesn't make any sense. I got to find it. It's really hard to use this PDF. Here we go. He says, some of the things that we have looked at, we thought were very concerning, are existing investments in projects, and specifically a project in Panama, the one in Toronto. These both got a lot of fraud associated with them, a lot of fraud allegations, a lot of activity that I would say smacks of fraud, and a lot of Russian mafia figures listed as buyers who may or may not have actually put money into it. So which is it? Which is it? Did they or didn't they? And what he's trying to argue here is that there's like a way to do money laundering, apparently, where if you can't get a business loan, you have people say, okay, I'm buying, 35,000 units in this condo building. And that's what you use as the basis for your loan, that the condos are already sold. And then, you get the money to build it. And then the people decide that they're not going to build them or they are, or buy them or they are. And it's illegal not to buy them once you've promised to buy them. So I'm not really, excuse me, sorry about that. I'm not really sure what he's getting at there. I'm really not. And then on page 45, he basically says that they found a picture of him with Sergey Million, and that's why they started looking into, Sergey Million and Donald Trump. There's pictures of Donald Trump with Hillary Clinton. Are you going to investigate Hillary Clinton too? And then they start going into how Michael Cohen is attached to attached to Sergey Million, etc., so on and so forth. And they found that Million was attached to Cohen through social media like Facebook and Twitter. On pages 50 and 51, it gets really irritating for me because Schiff says, you mentioned the limitations on your ability to follow the money in terms of potential money laundering involving Russian figures in the Trump organization. 2 questions. One is, did you also look at the Kushner business operation? And did you find any facts that cause concern in terms of potential money laundering through the Kushner properties or organization? And second, we do have the subpoena power that you don't. It is within the scope of our investigation to determine whether this was one of the Russian active measures, the use of financial means to entangle Mr. Trump. How would you go about using that? What institutions would you look at to be able to confirm or reject those allegations? And they get into here that they haven't found anything on Kushner, even though he attempts to go into detail about something that they found in regards to Kushner. They say that, we don't really have any solid evidence. We looked there, visa financing, the EB-5 program to get people in. I don't believe we concluded that we found any specific events of fraud, but it all had the look of appearance. It had all taken on the appearance of a controversial thing, which later became true. Did you ever obtain with respect to the money laundering allegations of the president's tax returns? No, but we did. We did look at other ways of finding out what his practices with regards to taxes were, and we found some great interesting documents in Las Vegas, I believe, and various other locations where he would, I think, gave much more realistic assessments of the income and values of his properties. And I suppose he would say that he was lowballing them to save on taxes, but I think he was actually probably telling more truthful statements about the financial condition of a lot of his properties, which was extremely poor. Two things. He's trying to embarrass Trump, trying to assert that he had failing businesses. And number 2, he basically just said that Trump is telling the truth on his taxes. However you want to spin that, by all means. On page 55, he's asked if he knows Steele's sources, and he replies that he would know their positioning to government officials. You may have already answered this with Mr. Gowdy, but do you know who Mr. Steele's sources were in Russia? And he says, I knew generally that where they're positioning. In other words, we would discuss generally where that person sat in relation to a senior government official, or, what other positions they held. So, isn't that working with a foreign government to influence the election? Isn't that working with the foreign government to influence the election? He just said we would discuss generally where that person sat in relation to a senior government official. So you're working with Steele, who's working with the Russian government. And what bizarro world? Why is nobody calling him on this? Why is nobody calling him on this? 57. Numerous things in the dossier have turned out to be verified. I don't have access to the intelligence or law enforcement information that I see made reference to. But things like, the Russian government has been investigating Hillary Clinton and has a lot of information about her and the Trump people are interested in getting that information. I mean, that turned out to be true. How did that turn out to be true? How? There's so much more in here. I'm trying to keep it manageable. Page 59. Did you inform the media? Simpson doesn't remember which outlets, but he assumed Clinton would win. Did you inform the media? Which ones? Major media? Anything specific? Okay, did you direct Steele to brief the media outlets? And Simpson says, yeah, we did it together. Initially, the reason was that everyone assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And when we initially briefed the media, that was our assumption. Everyone assumed. Everyone assumed. Everyone assumed. Everyone assumed. Everyone. Page 62. So Chris went, and this is Simpson talking. So Chris went and reported this to the Bureau. And he came back and he said, I reported this to the Bureau. And we did not ask permission from the clients to do that. The client didn't instruct us to do that. It was viewed as reporting a crime in progress, sort of a citizenship obligation. But the problem is that Steele is not a citizen. And Glenn Simpson didn't find it necessary to report that salacious part of the dossier to the FBI. And I don't understand how a citizenship obligation comes into it when Steele didn't even do it. Mr. Rooney says something really funny right after here. I just want to go back. He says, I have a note here to say, remember, Simpson didn't think it was necessary to brief the FBI because he couldn't verify and said he didn't know how to verify. And Steele isn't a citizen. He also asserts that the Russians hacked the emails with no proof. Yeah, he does this a lot, at a point later on, I think that as the questions, I'm not sure how to say this, as the hack attacks by the Russians on the Democrats became a major issue later in the year, questions of whether to engage the FBI, became more of a general issue. No proof. Mr. Rooney says, my time's up. But I will say that I think that the Russian scores in that Salt Lake Olympics were pretty low. Very suspicious. I didn't get to ask you about that, but it's always the Russians. Like everybody else has got a 10 or a 9 and the Russians are like 5. Do you see what he's doing there? The Russians don't do well. Let's investigate the Russians. Again, Schiff says, before I pass it off, you didn't have a chance to answer one of the questions I posed at the end. That is, we do have the subpoena power. If we are get to the bottom of this issue, of whether Russian organized crime money was used in the flipping of these properties and the purchase of the golf courses, and this is a lever over the president, what institutions would you use that process with to get to the bottom of it? And he goes into what he would do. Go to the banks, go to the title agencies, go to the title companies. They're basically just having, a conversation, with one another, about, what you'd find, It's a friendly little banter back and forth between Schiff and Simpson. Page 67. Quigley asks, and without getting into the exact communications, when did you start alerting your client that this might have been a bigger deal than, as you just described it, originally thought? Simpson says, I think that that would call for a confidential client communication. I think what I can say is, well, let me put it this way. I think it's now public that, the FBI had gone to the DNC prior to this and told them, that they'd been hacked by the Russian government. And, foreign intelligence services hacking American political operations is not that unusual, actually. And there's a lot of foreign intelligence services that play in American elections. And so that in itself isn't actually totally alarming. The Chinese did it last time. The Indians do it. But when the suggestion that they were going to weaponize the information and that this was more than just an intel gathering operation, that they were actually going to engage in active measures, that was when, it became a major issue. How do you know that the Russians hacked the DNC servers? The DNC didn't even allow them to look at the servers. CrowdStrike were the only company that looked at those servers. The DNC refused to allow the FBI to look at their servers. I wonder why. Maybe it's because there was a leak. CrowdStrike tried to make it look like a hack. And if the FBI looked at the servers, they may have figured that out. What they would have done with that information back then is beyond me. Probably nothing good, depending on who did the looking. If it was struck, who knows? Who knows? On page 70, again, he's trying to protect himself against disinformation that came out of the dossier by making it clear that it's human intelligence, and humans sometimes lie, and more frequently, they just get it wrong. And then, did he ever, in talking to you subsequent to the release of the document, say that he thought he would alter any of it after the fact or information he had gathered later? And Simpson says, I have talked to him about that, and he continues to believe that it is largely not disinformation. Largely not. Again, what does largely not mean? That there is some, that there isn't some, that there are lies, that there aren't lies? What does it mean? What does it mean? Page 77, something very interesting for me came up. The timing of this. And I'll go over it with you guys now. So on page 77, the question is asked, switching gears a little bit, going over to you testified earlier that Mr. Steele went to the FBI at a certain point in time, approximately late June 2016. Is that correct? And the answer from Simpson, this transcript is horrible. Yeah, I think what I said was he raised the issue of going to the FBI with me after the first memo. And I didn't give him an answer, or I didn't sign off on that. And then he raised it again a few days later. And by approximately early July, the 1st or the 2nd, I had given my assent to him doing it as a professional obligation or a citizenship obligation. And that's when he did it, sometime around the 4th of July. And they kind of firm up the time. You remember, Hillary Clinton was interviewed on July 2nd. It's very interesting that right after her testimony that was not under oath with Peter Strzok, etc., these people decide to go to the FBI with the information about Trump Russia. Very interesting. And not even any good information, just the fact that he may have been filmed. They don't have any tape, but he may have been filmed doing something disgusting in a hotel room in Russia, which we know didn't happen. So that's a really interesting timeline point there for me. And then he says that right after the election, he was approached by Bruce Orr right after the election at around Thanksgiving. So, question. Did the FBI ever reach out to you or Fusion GPS in relation to the matters that Mr. Steele had informed them upon? No. Answer. Question. You've never heard from anyone in the U.S. government in relation to these matters, either the FBI or the Department of Justice? After the election? During the election, no. What did you hear after and from whom and when? Answer. I was asked to provide some information to the Justice Department. Question. By whom and when? Answer. It was by a prosecutor named Bruce Orr, who was following up. I can't remember when. It was sometime after Thanksgiving, I think. Thanksgiving of 2016? Yes. Did Mr. Orr reach out to you, or how did that shake out originally? I think, Chris, it was someone that Chris Steele knows. Question. I'm sorry, Chris Steele knows who? Answer. Bruce Orr, wife Nellie Orr. Sound familiar? Question. Okay. Answer. And I met Bruce, too, through organized crime conferences or something like that. And Chris Chris told me that he had been talking to Bruce, that he had told Bruce about what happened, and that Bruce wanted more information and suggested that I speak with Bruce. The context of this is that it was after the election. A very surprising thing had happened, which is that Donald Trump had won. By that time, we were enormously concerned about rapidly accumulating indications that the Russian government had mounted a massive attack on the American election system. And that, Donald Trump or his associates might have been involved. What are you talking about? They never touched the voting system. Clearly, the dossier is nonsense. There's no proof that they hacked the election, and there's no proof that Donald Trump had anything to do with it. And there was a lot of alarming things happening, including Donald Trump saying things about Vladimir Putin that really didn't make any sense, weren't ordinary things for a Republican to say. Well, he's not an ordinary Republican. And anyway, I didn't. So we had also by this time given information to the FBI, and they had, indicated to Chris that they were investigating it, and then apparently told the New York Times they weren't. And so it was not clear to us whether anyone at a high level of government was aware of the information that Chris had gathered and provided to the FBI. And so, so we were, frankly, very scared for the country and for ourselves, and felt that if we could give it to someone else, we should, higher up. Oh, they were petrified for the country, frankly. Frankly, we were scared for the country and for ourselves. Oh my goodness. Give me a break. This is just disgusting to me. And so Chris suggested I give some information to Bruce, give him the background to all this. And we eventually met at a coffee shop, and I told him the story. Page 82. He goes to look into his business dealings in Russia, but there are no business dealings in Russia. What I will say, he says, The question is, did you tell Mr. Steele what you expected him to find? The answer is no. What I will say is I was quite shocked by what he came back with. And the general mandate was to look into Donald Trump's business dealings in Russia and see if he could come up with a little bit more information about who was doing business over there and why. You know, in the course of all these trips, he never seemed to be able to consummate a deal. So that was the general assignment. '91. I skipped a lot of the Michael Cohen stuff because it just doesn't interest me. You guys can read it. So, this part is interesting. We're talking about Browder, and we're talking about the Previzin case, the Magnitsky Act stuff. And the question is, originally way back there, tell us about what you did with Previzin. And he goes into this big, long spiel about it. Sorry, and he apologizes for taking so long. And then on page 91, he says, the lawyers asked me how to figure out how we could subpoena him. So I found that his hedge fund was registered in Delaware, and therefore he had corporate presence in the United States, which meant that, theoretically at least, he can be subpoenaed through his hedge fund because he was listed as an officer in the records. So we subpoenaed the hedge fund. We then retroactively filed new documentation with the SEC, taking his name off the record, said it was all a mistake. And he said, you can't subpoena me. I'm not really an officer of that hedge fund. Now, why is this important? Why is this important? Because during the Previzin case, he was working with Baker Hostetler, a law firm. And back in the testimony that we went over just recently, Schiff asks, I think it was actually the majority party asks, well, why didn't you go after any of this stuff? And he says, well, because I don't know how. I don't know how. I can't do any of that stuff. I can't subpoena. But here he's saying, he had no problem subpoenaing. Now, I get that there wasn't an active case against Trump, but if this was of vital national importance, like they want us to believe it was, right? And if Perkins Coie is paying like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and millions eventually of dollars for this thing, why not start up some litigation so that they can subpoena these things the way they did in the Browder case? Doesn't make any sense, does it? Doesn't make any sense. So he knows exactly how to do it. They just didn't do it because there's nothing there. Why is Simpson lying about having to know how to subpoena when he says that he organized a subpoena service down in here too? He organized a subpoena service. He supervised it. It's all lies. It's all lies. 95 and 96. Schiff is such a little snake, I swear. They talk about all the Russians here involved in the Trump deals that really aren't illegal at all. There's nothing illegal. And there's no basis or facts for any of it. And then he says at the bottom of page 96 that someone said they drank Cristal with Trump, which this is all hearsay, right? But the problem is Sergey Millian says he tells a story about meeting Donald Trump at the golf at a racetrack, drinking a bottle of Cristal with him. He gave him some Cristal. And that was in the early phases of the product. So it was clear that Donald Trump, so the equity partner, was the related group. If this is, he gave him a bottle of Cristal, he drank with him. Donald Trump doesn't drink. I keep hitting my foot. Donald Trump doesn't drink. Not that that's a big deal in all this, but he doesn't drink. So, is it possible that Sergey Millian was lying? Exaggerating? Do you have any facts whatsoever? There are no facts here. Literally, it's just hearsay. I think this person did this, and I think his name was that, and I think it might be called this, and I think this is just ridiculous. Ridiculous. So we're on page 97. We're going to go to page 99 where they start talking about WikiLeaks and Roger Stone. Now, We gradually, towards the end of the project, became very interested in, Roger Stone bragged about having his contact. We tried to figure out who the contact was. We started going into who Stone was and who his relationships were with. And essentially, the trail led to sort of an international far right. And Brexit happened, and Nigel Farage became someone that we were very interested in, and I think it's still very interesting. And so I formed my own opinions that went through that there was a somewhat unacknowledged relationship between the Trump people and the UKIP people, and that the path to WikiLeaks ran through that. So I formed my own opinions that there was a connection between Trump and WikiLeaks and UKIP. And I still think that today. Well, why? And then they go on to talk about Cambridge Analytica and Brexit and Bannon and UKIP in 2011, and they try to do the anti-Tea Party and blah, 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 blah. And Schiff says, were you able to find any factual links between the Mercers and Assange or WikiLeaks or Farage? And Simpson says, the things that we heard, which, I think could be sorted out by an official inquiry, are that Nigel Farage made a number of trips to New York and had a number of meetings. Nigel Farage and Airbank had a number of trips to the U.S., and that that there's been a misrepresentation of the length of that relationship and the extent of it. I've been told and have not confirmed. Why are you saying it then? That Nigel Farage had additional trips to the Ecuadorian embassy than the one that's been in the papers, and that he provided data to Assange. What kind of data? Can we just get an answer to that? A thumb drive. I've been told and have not confirmed. Why are you saying that? What kind of a charade is this? What is this? This is a charade. This is a charade. Like an utter charade. Where is I just don't understand. There's no basis in reality in any of this stuff. It's all hearsay. Nothing is facts. It's like between the minority group and Simpson, it's basically just like who can kiss the other person's ass better. He talks about this being in the New York Times, and that's why he thinks it. Now, there's a lot of reading coming up here because it's really important. And I'm going to read it. And my last question for you, Mr. Simpson, is why did you go direct to Mr. Steele to go to the media with the information in the Steele dossier? And I want you guys to listen to his answer. I'm going to be reading 4 pages here. Sure. Well, so there were 2 instances of this, or rounds of it, and I think I was beginning to recount this earlier. In whatever the first round was, I assume it was sometime in mid-September or early October. It was mainly about telling the press, a few high-level members of the national security press, and the, top-level press, that we had information that there was a Russian intelligence operation that the Russians were very engaged in. That this was more than just hacking, and there was a major effort to interfere with the election, and that it allegedly involved the Trump organization. And the reason for that, the motivation for that, was mainly because I thought this was a historic, and that it was something the press needed to investigate and know about and ask the intelligence community about, because I wanted to expose it. But we were operating under the assumption at the time that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election, and so there was no urgency to it. So I'm just going to stop there. So there's no urgency to it if he's not going to win. There's no urgency to it if Donald Trump isn't going to win. Because who cares at that point if the Russians are interfering with the election? If your candidate is going to win anyway, why would we pay any attention to it? Why would we look into the Russians interfering in our elections if your candidate was going to win anyway and there was no urgency to it? You are a contradictory nightmare, Mr. Simpson. You are nonpartisan. You are partisan. You are partisan. And you don't care about the country. Because if you cared about the country, you would have been reporting this anyway if that's the case, if what you're saying here is true. You're disgusting. Disgusting. I will continue. And there was an assumption on my part that nothing would be published about any of this anytime likely before the election. And I wanted to tell them about it because that's when it was happening. But I didn't it was basically in a political campaign. When you get past Labor Day, people stop publishing stories that could be perceived as a late hit or an October surprise or some kind of a stunt. But it's the Russians hacking the election. I'm so frustrated. I am so frustrated at this. And so, in a presidential campaign, you're sort of winding down at that point. All the information that you needed to gather for debates or political ads or anything like that, it's all been gathered. And so anyway, we wanted people to know. And we were also of the view by that point, we'd been doing the research for 2+ months. We were of the view that there was really something here, that this was really bad, and there was some serious allegations that it wasn't just Russians. It was Russians working with Americans. So that was round one. Then, and indeed, no one ran off and wrote a big story about how a British spy thinks that, the Russians are working with the Trump people. There were, a trickle of stories, I guess more than a trickle, but there were some very limited stories about people associated with Trump having connections to the Russians. And I can remember specifically there being stories about Carter Page and his trip to Moscow and the fact that that was something that was of FBI interest and that Carter Page stuff is something that we covered with the media. But anyway, so none of the media made a dent in the sort of general coverage, and it didn't bother me because I wasn't expecting any of it to really make a dent. What? Come the end of October, some extraordinary things started happening. The Russians, WikiLeaks, releases John Podesta's emails. And then, the most extraordinary of all, James Comey sends a letter to Congress saying he is reopening the Hillary Clinton email investigation. And that was, I believe, around the 25th. And if you're me, and you have been in politics and campaigns and investigations, and this is your whole world, and you have basically been doing it since you got out of college, one of the things that is really ingrained in you is the rules of Washington. And when I say rules, I mean like regulations of the Justice Department about interfering with the election. It's not, I'm going to go back to this in a second. It is not something that you are just aware of as a technical requirement. It is something the people embrace, which is that law enforcement shouldn't interfere in elections by announcing investigations of people at the last minute. And so we were shocked. And I felt, I guess I was angry. But in any case, the result of that was predictable, which is that, it began to influence the election. And so we tried to decide how to respond to that. And when I say we, I mean like me and my little, company. My little company and Chris. And, I didn't have any dealings with Miss Clinton or any of these other people. They were dealing with, that was their thing. But I was sitting on this piece of knowledge, which was, in fact, the FBI was investigating the Trump Organization for possibly having illegal dealings with the government of Russia. And you can imagine if you were me or Chris Steele, and we've been sitting here working blank, and they seem to be very seriously running a counterintelligence or espionage investigation into the Trump Organization, and all of a sudden they announce they are reopening the Hillary case. You're kind of, what's going on here? So at that point, I, of course, was really confused. And I would say Chris was a little scared because he thought that he didn't really understand what was going on with the FBI. In any event, at that point, I felt the rules had just been thrown out and that Comey had violated the sort of one of the most sacrosanct policies, which is not announcing running law enforcement or activity into the closing days of an election. And so we began talking to the press again we decided that if James Comey wasn't going to tell people about this investigation, that, he had violated the rules, and we would only be fair if the world knew that both candidates were under FBI investigation. Holy crap. I could really just stop here. He says multiple times that he barely ever gets involved in this political stuff in terms of, political opposition research. Only a couple times every 4 years, once in a blue, he gets involved with political, investigations and oppo research. But then he says, when this was your whole world and this is what you do and this is all you do. You've been in politics and campaigns and this is your whole world and you've been doing it basically since you got out of college. The rules of Washington are ingrained in you. like regulations about the Justice Department. It's embraced. So we decided, my little company and I, with the backing of one of the largest attorney law firms in the world, we decide we're going to influence the election too. If James Comey's not going to tell people that he's investigating this, well then, by golly, it would only be fair if the world knew that both candidates were under FBI investigation. So we decided to tamper and inject ourselves and influence a presidential election with the help of a foreign government, in that of Russia. Wow. Page 110. I should have just ended it. It's pretty clear. So, this testimony here just basically demonstrates that he's clearly an operative of the Democratic Party. Clearly. And we can read through it, but 113 is about, what he didn't know about Podesta and Manafort and blah, blah, blah. Like, they talk a lot about what Manafort does over in the Ukraine and in Russia, but they forget and neglect to add. And they talk about Stone involved in that too. But as you know, through the video that I did in regards to Manafort and lobbying, the lobbying backstory, Manafort and Stone created a lobbying forum with the Podestas. And that's conveniently left out. Finkelstein worked with Stone and Manafort in the Ukraine when Stone and Manafort were working with the Podestas. They leave that out. He leaves that out. He's an operative, plain and simple. They gloss over the fact that they got the wrong Cohen and Prague. On page 123, the majority asserts that basically they I'm going to show you because it's really cool. A couple times I can be a cheerleader. A couple times. They're talking about the dossier. They're talking about Veselnitskaya, the Russian meeting. And the question from the majority is, which is the Republicans. I mean, we've talked a lot about coincidences and interesting connections, but I mean, it's quite something that you would have been investigating Trump for 8 months, and one of your colleagues from this other litigation who you were with shortly before and after that meeting had, in fact, met with Trump Jr. and other high-ranking Trump associates on a related topic in the same time period. His lawyer says, "Is there a question?" Questioner says, No. It's a statement. On page 124, he again asserts that the Russians hacked the election with zero evidence whatsoever. It's just an assumption that has no basis in fact. 125 is interesting to me because they get into the Russian oligarch that purchased the property from Trump in Florida, who also was the one who sold that record-breaking painting that I did the video on a couple months ago to the new prince in Saudi Arabia. I am still looking there. Very interesting to me. He talks about art deals in here. You guys can read that. I'm wrapping it up. I don't like to go too much more than an hour. Page 134. This was interesting to me as well. The question. And so once you conducted that research, it made its way, you understood, to Mrs. Veselnitskaya. Did you understand at the time that it was potentially making its way from her to the upper ranks of the Kremlin? He says no. Question. But it's fair to say, however, that the negative viewpoints expressed in this memo regarding Mr. Browder and Mr. Magnitsky are consistent with the Kremlin's own viewpoints on these matters. Answer. They are consistent with the Kremlin's. They are not consistent with mine. Interesting. They're just trying to say you were working for the Russian government. You do realize that, right? Because he was. Page 137. He has a tough time remembering meetings he had with Veselnitskaya and other Russians. He just can't remember. He can't remember who he met with and when. I don't know if we met specifically. We may have had some drinks. We may have gone to lunch. She didn't speak English. Question. He tries to basically downgrade the fact that she was working with the Russian government and he was working with her, which is what we touched upon in the Senate testimony. Direct contradiction from him. This was just beyond for me. 143 and 144, he starts to say how Russians infiltrated the NRA and various other right-wing groups, he's basically trying to assert that the Russians have infiltrated the conservative wing of the country and they're working with them to, somehow influence what we think. It is just the most utterly ridiculous nonsense I've ever heard in my life. I don't even know how these people get away with this shit. Excuse my French. On page 143 and 144. You said there were other conservative groups. Are there other conservative groups in the United States that they have infiltrated to your knowledge? Simpson says, I think there's been. We've done some research on some religious groups having relationships with the Russians, developing, and pursuing relationships with various religious groups. The name of them escape my mind. But there sure has been a lot of that. And then there's been independence movements. California independence, Texas independence. It's a big operation. These people are sick. They talk about Prague, even though he never went to Prague. They talk about the work on his work on the Clinton Foundation and Uranium One. And interestingly, on page 153, we learn that probably with the Washington Free Beacon, Glenn Simpson and Fusion GPS were digging up Oppo research on none other than Ted Cruz. So it wasn't specific to Trump with them. I remember we did work on Ted Cruz. I think it was part of the Beacon matter. And it was a long while ago. And I just didn't remember it, but I remember it now. We looked at some Cruz-related stuff. Any of the other 16 candidates? I don't remember, but it was a while ago. I just don't recall. How do you forget that? I don't remember if we did any work. That's bullshit. And then Schiff goes into something really interesting, and then we're going to end. He says something that'll probably bite them in the butt now that this is released. He says, hold on, 157. Oh, what happened? Here we go. I'm sorry, guys. For some reason, this isn't working right for me. This is important. Oh, okay. Here we go. The reason I asked this question is, and you probably have seen this, there's a conspiracy theory that the Russians were, either through Ms. Veselnitskaya or elseways, feeding you misinformation to go into the dossier to spur an FBI investigation as part of a Russian active measures campaign. Is there any truth to that theory that you can see? There is no truth to that theory in my mind. I would certainly agree with the observation that for these matters to have intersected in the way they did is remarkable, and it caught me totally by surprise. And as best as I can figure, the Russians were up to a lot of stuff, and I only know about some of it. So that we were tricked by the Russians thing that got floated around is just debunked by Schiff and Simpson in this testimony. And that, my friends, is basically it, except for that they bring up Eric Prince on page 162, and they just basically say, I don't know if he's behind any of this, but he had some interesting connections. And there we go. That's it. A bunch of nonsense and lies and disgusting, partisanship and a witch hunt and everything that we knew it always was. So I would like to say, if you appreciate the work I do and you'd like to become a patron, I would be honored to have you with me on my Patreon page. You can find me there at patreon.com/TracyBeans with a Z. If you are feeling generous, I will put my PayPal address in the description box below. You can also follow me on Twitter and Gab at TracyBeans, TracyBeanz. I am still looking into doing a couple of videos today if I can, and I'll get them out as soon as possible. There's a lot going on, and I'm really focused on this stuff. And thank you guys for the support. Thanks for paying attention. No, this is long stuff. It can get monotonous, but I feel it's important to document. So thank you guys. Have a great Saturday, and I will talk to you very soon.